Episode 46, From a Life in Prison to a Life of Purpose, Chris Wilson. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Chris Wilson. At the age of 17, Chris Wilson was sentenced to life for murder. He turned his life around while in prison and was released after 16 years. Today, he's the owner of Barclay Investment Corporation, a social enterprise specializing in residential and commercial contracting work and employing out-of-work Baltimore residents. His other business ventures include the House of DaVinci, a high-end furniture restoration and design company, and Master Plan Productions, a social impact content development company. His book is called The Master Plan: My Journey from Life in Prison to a Life of Purpose. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hate to start with such a dark chapter in your life. Chris, you had a really rough childhood. It was hard for me to read the book without wincing. So first off, you're surrounded by crime, drugs, and violence. I mean, constantly. It's just all around you. You buried, I think, 6 of your friends by the time you were a teenager. Your parents divorced at a young age, and then your mother remarried to someone, a cop who was physically abusive to her and to you as well. And then on top of that, your brother would just sort of beat you up for kicks.
Right.
I mean, not the sort of, playtime things, siblings do, but would really hurt you. And it just, all of these things just over and over and over again. So it sounds like you were just growing up in a nightmare.
It was a nightmare. I still have nightmares about like my upbringing. So yeah, I think that's an accurate portrayal of it. And this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And this was a time when the crack epidemic was sweeping through a lot of the major American cities. And so around this time, Washington, D.C., unfortunately, was for a year or two like the murder capital of the United States. And so there would be shootings every single day in my neighborhood. And oftentimes when we called the police, they wouldn't show up. And I was a good kid. I played the cello and like I was on the chess team, but like the environmental factors outside of my house were so strong that I couldn't stay focused to like my education and my studies because we're losing so many people.
So you're playing cello and you're playing chess. I mean, and I'm not trying to stereotype, it's just not what you usually associate,
right?
People from that background. Was that you, or was that your parents' influence? What was even compelling you to want to take up these things?
I believe it was my mom's influence because growing up, I wasn't into sports. I didn't watch a lot of TV. I would get in trouble for just trying to get to the library to read about dinosaurs or Greek mythology. And so my mom wanted me like to do stuff during the summer or just like stay active. And so she would send me away to like gyms or like just to do stuff. And I kind of took a liking to music and to playing chess. And then I made this chess team and I would travel around. But my brother and people in my neighborhood was like, that's lame. What are you playing chess for on the cello? Nobody does that. And I kind of allowed people to influence me to give up like, my educational pursuits and artistic side.
I mean, I'm guessing some kids growing up in these crime-infested neighborhoods, there must be a feeling of hopelessness for a lot of them. Like you're forever stuck in this life and there's no escape. And maybe that's the backdrop for why so many of these kids, eventually turned to gangs and violence and drugs. So is that how you felt? Or was there ever a time you can remember, and maybe it was back when you were doing the cello and chess, where you could sort of control your own destiny and that you'd eventually escape this life and create a better life for yourself?
So when I was young, and playing cello and playing chess. Of course, I thought that I would be able to travel the world, that I would embrace my education and like things would be better. Even though like things were happening around me, I would see stuff. But my grandmother, for example, would tell me like, just do what you have to do, and you're gonna be okay. Don't worry about what's going on around you. But like at a certain point, when my mom's attacked and sexually assaulted in front of me, I'm attacked as well. And then people are just dying every couple of months. You know, my brother gets shot, my cousin gets killed, and just all this stuff is happening. And we would like call the police and reach out. They just wouldn't show up in our neighborhood. And at a certain point, I just felt like, you know, like nobody cares about us in this community. And maybe I won't make it out. Everyone else isn't making it out. And so at a certain point, maybe at age 14, I just lost hope. And I said, I probably won't make it to 21. And so I might as well just, you know, I started drinking and smoking weed. And I just figured that, success probably wasn't meant for people like myself.
You talk about you were 14 and then you started, getting into some bad, bad habits, if you want to call it that. Was there a very particular inflection point you can remember? Was there an event that triggered something? Like you woke up one day and you said, you know what, the life I thought I might have one day, that's never going to happen. And, here I go. Or was it just a very gradual thing that sort of crept up?
I would say there was an event, like when my mom was raped in front of me. I tried to take her to the hospital, but I ended up taking her to a police station. And the way they treated my mom, it really it destroyed me. Like they talked to my mom like it was her fault. I heard them mumbling, calling her names and saying that this police officer will be right back with her like the next day. And because this person was a police officer, he didn't do a lot of time, and he got back out and he started stalking my family. And nobody really cared. Even my family members, people just would say, just go to school. And like we didn't have food in the house. No one like helped us out. And then every time this guy would show up and try to break into the house, we'd call the police. They wouldn't do anything. And so it was around that moment when I just came to I was just like, things aren't going to be good for life. And as a young kid, how does a young kid process like all those events? And my mom never worked again after that. Like she fell into a depression. She got hooked on pills because they overprescribed her. She started drinking every day. And so, we had to juggle electricity, the gas bill. We got an eviction notice eventually. I mean, it was bad. And like, I don't, looking back on it now, how does a young kid process all these events? I just wanted to be a kid. I wanted to go out and just like have fun, but I couldn't do that.
So do you have any sort of sense as to what this period in your life did to you long term, years later, decades later? Like, are there permanent emotional scars?
Absolutely. And so I go to therapy once a week. I still struggle with PTSD. One of the main reasons why I wanted to write this book was I wanted to tell my story because there's so many men and women, particularly in communities of color, who experience the same thing that I went through. And oftentimes when these young people reach a inflection point or whatever, and maybe commit a crime and do something, and then the media will be quick and society be quick to label this person like a monster. But what about all the stuff that these young people go through up until that point? And so, America is a very reactionary country. We should be more preventative and like just try to keep children, young people in particular, from getting to that point where they end up taking a person's life or doing something crazy.
Back just to what you were growing up around you, the violence and everything. Were you ever afraid? Like just afraid to even leave the house, that could be your last days? Someone's going to shoot you without your knowing? Or is it just happening so often with such, regularity? It just becomes like the new normal.
When I was younger, as in like 14 and younger, I was terrified. And I actually had different routes that I would go through different alleys and places just to duck like the corners where the drug dealers were, or like where stuff would happen, or where someone was just killed, just to get to school. But then past 14, I became desensitized to a lot of stuff that happened around me. I started getting arrested. I started carrying guns, and I started self-medicating with alcohol and like weed, and at a certain point using PCP, kind of to numb myself against like the stuff that was happening around me. And then as a survival mechanism, like you desensitize yourself to like someone just got killed out front of the house and they're laying outside, and you just like, well, that's just how it is around this neighborhood. And if I think too much about it, then like I can't function. And so then imagine an entire community that's desensitized to it.
So you mentioned guns in there. So I understand maybe the drugs were to sort of numb you and take you to a different place. What was behind the gun? Did someone say, "Hey, Chris, you got to start carrying this around"? Did you yourself decide you needed it? Was it self-defense? Was it more, because you had bad intent with it?
So I would say it was more self-defense. So once my brother and cousin got shot and my cousin got killed, I mean, I knew like everyone in our neighborhood had guns, but I felt like I didn't need one. But when you see stray bullets and like random people get killed in your neighborhood just for like no reason, or just for their tennis shoes, or maybe a jacket that they're wearing, and all I could think about was, I just don't want it to happen to me. And so my thought process was, if I could get a gun, and if people in my neighborhood know I have it, then they won't bother me. Because there were people who like, yeah, we know that person has a gun or has two guns, and they stay to themselves, like we're not going to bother him. And so that was my thinking process. But thinking back on it now, like you have it at some point, like you might be put in a situation to use it or be more likely to use it.
You had a son at the young age of 16. Now, many years later, you would come to learn that you actually weren't the biological father, but you didn't know that at the time. So with the gravity of being a father, you tried to mend your ways. You went back to school, you got a job, but it didn't seem like that straight path lasted all that long.
Right. I would say this, like having a child, like it changes you, and you start to think like, even though like life is rough, like the priority is this child's life. And so I did what I could. I went back to school. I got a job, even though I was making like $5 an hour and wasn't making a lot of money. But at this point, we were behind in our rent, utilities and stuff were on and off. And I was giving all the money that I would make, which wasn't a lot, 100 and 200 bucks tops or something like that. And I would give it to my mom, like to pay bills and stuff. And she would like buy drugs and alcohol with it. And it just didn't work. And like that made it worse because I was, going to school, I'm working. And by the way, I was taking care of this child. I had temporary custody, so I'm changing the Pampers and I'm staying up late, and I'm still a child, like a teenager, and I was just stressed out, and it just wasn't enough. Just wasn't enough.
I think one of the more frightful days in your life all started when a car pulled up to the house. Someone pulled a gun on you, told you to get in the car. Who are these people? What do they want? What do they do with you?
So I remember I was actually out in front of the house with my son in the stroller, and it was a nice day. My oldest brother was out washing a car, and then I saw these cars ride by, and they were the same cars of some friends that I had, and so I waved at them, and they turned around, but they were really there to get me, and so they turned around when I walked up to the car. It turns out I didn't know these people, and they pulled guns on me and pulled me into the car, and they were accusing me of stealing some drugs from them, which I didn't do. I didn't sell drugs or anything like that. And they took me to a vacant house. They were debating about where they wanted to dump my body and stuff. And I'm terrified. These are grown men, by the way. And they took me to the house, and they were just like, where are our drugs at? And I was like, I don't know, y'all. Like, and turns out it was someone who I was friends with took the drugs and just said that I had them. And so they were about to kill me. And then eventually they realized that I wasn't the right person. And I was terrified. And by the way, I had a gun on me. I had a gun on me when they rolled up and pulled the gun. But again, like my purpose wasn't to use the gun. It was like a defense mechanism. And so I froze up. And so eventually when all this stuff was over and I made it back home, right, and my mom and my friends laughed at me because they was like, how did you let this happen when you had a gun on you? And that's when that happened, it changed me. And I was like, I'll never hesitate again.
So, with all these emotions stirring up, was it that night where you left the house to go on this walk?
It wasn't that night. It was sometime shortly after that.
So sometime soon, you go on this walk, and a couple guys, start walking behind you, getting closer and closer. And next comes a pivotal moment that would forever alter the course of your life? What happened?
So when these guys started following me, I mean, I knew they wasn't from my neighborhood, and in the back of my mind, like a lot of things were happening. So I figured they could be after me, and if that's the case, then I'm gonna go somewhere where there's a lot of people and there's a lot of light. And so it was like a 7-Eleven, a gas station, and it was like people coming and going. So I said, I'll go here. And there's a payphone there, and I said, well, they probably won't bother me here. And it just didn't work. Like I was by the payphone, and these two guys walked up to me and surrounded me. Was like, "Are you Chris?" And I was like, "Yeah, what's up?" And he says, "We've been watching you. We've been watching your family. Don't think that you're safe." And while the one guy's talking to me, another guy's is walking, circling around me and trying to get behind me. And I kept trying to turn and look at him. And then as he was coming up on me, I just pulled my gun and I just started shooting. And then they both ran in one direction, and I ran in the other direction. And I ended up taking a person's life. And I didn't even know it until, like, weeks later when I got arrested.
What do you think their intent was?
I don't know. Like maybe to scare me, maybe to beat me up or something. I don't know.
Did they have weapons on them? Did they have guns on them?
I didn't give them a chance to even like pull any weapons. So I don't know. And I know like they ran away, and the person I ended up killing died a block away in front of like another store. So I don't know. And then the other person, like, I never heard from him again.
When you heard the news, when you found out that this person had died, do you remember how you felt at the time?
I was in disbelief because, again, I know now like that I shot this person 6 times, but like they ran away, and I was like, I just don't believe it. So eventually, like, I realized that it was that I did do it. And to be honest with you, and I write about this, like, it took me a long time to really genuinely feel remorse for like what I had done, because up until the point where I committed my crime, I was, smoking PCP, and people were dying, and I was listening to like the wrong music. At the time, I felt like it was the victims like fault for like initiating this and making me do it, right. Only until I got a little older and going through therapy when I was in prison that I genuinely like felt remorse and understood like the gravity of like what I did, that I took something from society that I couldn't replace.
Wow. So, now, you're still a young teenager. You're sentenced to life in prison. I mean, Chris, I can't even start to imagine what that must have felt like, being locked up behind bars for what you thought at the time when you first stepped foot in the prison was going to be the rest of your life. Can you share any memories from those early hours, days?
It would probably be one of the worst moments of my life to have someone sentence you to natural life in prison. And then once I'm sentenced, I was sent to solitary confinement, and it just was a nightmare. And after being sentenced, my family, my friends, they just stopped coming to see me because they didn't know what they could even say to me. Like, what do you say to someone who's given a slow death sentence? And everyone else within like the institution, I had heard, like, in the state of Maryland, when you get a life sentence, you usually grow old and you die there. And so I just remember going to my cell and just crying like a baby, like for hours. It was tough.
And what was it like once you're there and it's sort of settling in? What was day-to-day life like? Everything's relative, right? It wasn't one of the worst prisons. What was it like just in those, that first year, let's say?
It was like being teleported to another planet. Just different rules, different guidelines. I mean, it started off by me being humiliated by the prison guards, being stripped naked, and they made me bend over and like spread and cough, and it was like, hold that position right there, and just like for like a minute or two, and they laughed at me, and like that was my introduction to prison, to let me know like I'm now just a number and not a real person. And then once you go through all the gates and you get inside the prison, I see people who have been in there for 30 and 40 years who also went in as juveniles. And they told me, get comfortable, because like this is your new home, and you won't make it out. Everything that's on the street except guns is all around you: drugs, fighting, gangs. And, contrary to what people think, like the prisoners run the prison. Like the guards, they just keep you in there. But like everything, they control everything in there. And, I was 118 pounds when I went to prison. So How am I going to survive in here? What am I going to do? And I fell into a deep depression. And then again, I just started smoking weed, and I kept thinking to myself, how is my life over? I just got here. Like, I didn't have a mustache on my face. It was a tough time for me my first year.
If we fast forward, the movie here a little bit, 1 minute you're filled with, drugs and other vices, and we're still, I think, pretty angry, and bitter. And next thing you know, you're not smoking, you're not drinking, you stop the drugs, you're eating healthy, you're reading books. I mean, you're teaching yourself Italian and other languages, and you're taking up carpentry. Like, what the hell happened? I mean, what made you finally decide to just get it together? And what was the turning point for you?
So I think around this time, when I would stay out the window, I would think about when I was younger, what my mom used to instill in me about, entrepreneurship and being able to travel the world. And then when I briefly was on the chess team and like playing the cello, like my teachers would see stuff in me that I at the time didn't see in myself. And so I knew, and I was always a good reader. So I knew I was intelligent, and I knew I had a good heart, even though I was carrying a gun and, getting in trouble. Like, I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just didn't want anyone to hurt me. And so at this point, when I'm in prison, I was thinking about, I know in my heart I'm a good person. I know I'm intelligent. And now it's time to prove to myself, to everyone else, like, what I can really do. And I happened around this time when I was thinking this, there was a young guy who also had a life sentence, and he was studying computer code and writing out codes on paper. And that's what he would do every day. He would mentor and tutor other folks. And so after talking to him, he told me, I'm going to get out of prison. I'm going to start a software company. I'm going to make millions of dollars. I'm going to buy my dream car. I'm going to be successful. And at first I laughed because I said, we got life. We're not getting out of here. And he looked at me and he was serious. And he was like, I'm getting out, and this is the way out. And so it was at that moment I went back into my cell, and I stayed there for a couple of days. And I just was like writing on paper, like all the things that I wanted to do, all the places that I wanted to travel, and people that I wanted to meet and stuff like that. And I made a copy of it, and I sent a copy to my judge, and I sent a copy to my grandmother, because like everyone listens to grandma. And I wanted to share my list with someone so that they can hold me accountable. At that day, I just started like working really hard.
So this is what you called your master plan.
Right.
I want to talk about that, but just to back up the tape for a minute here, what is it that gave you hope that, if you turn your life around, that you'll be released? I mean, you were given life in prison. So did you truly, truly have hope that if you get yourself together and get on the right path, that somehow that'll lead to your freedom? Or did you just say, I may be in here for life, but at least I can do something about, myself while I'm here? Like, what? Help me understand this.
So, this might sound a little silly, right? But when I was in solitary confinement, I read this book, and it was about when Senator John McCain, like he's now passed away, but it was when he was detained in Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam, and he was captured. And I remember reading about him, and there was a guy next door to him who was also a prisoner of war, and he would tell them we'd be home by Christmas. And like, they didn't believe him. Like, they waited for years, right? And at a certain point, they started, just to imagine like that they would be home by Christmas. And it allowed them to get through the tough times. It gave them a little bit of hope. And so for me, at this point in prison, I told myself I probably can get out of here in 7 years. If I work the program, if I get I demonstrate myself in therapy and education, I probably get back in court, get my sentence reduced, and hopefully I can get out.
Hang on. Like, was there precedent for that? Were there other prisoners who had been sentenced to life and they started, doing righteous things in prison? They got out after 7 years?
No.
Okay. So what did you call this?
A positive delusion.
Positive delusion. Did you know at the time this was a positive delusion, or only in hindsight?
Only in hindsight. But it was, like, how do you get up in the morning and work and read books and study and exercise and train and not believe? Like I had to lie to myself, and I just chose to believe it. And even people, my friends, were like, dude, it's not going to happen. But what are you doing? It was the only way I could get up if I just chose to believe it. And so I guess I was lying to myself, but it worked a little bit. I mean, it did work, not a little bit.
Yeah. So this master plan, let's go back to that. This master plan, things you want to accomplish in your life. What compelled you to write it down? Why was that important, that exercise?
So I felt like things on paper, something that I can like look at every day when I get up in the morning and before I go to bed, just resonated more deeply within myself. It's always like that. Like growing up, like put like if I get a good grade on a paper or something and it was on the refrigerator and I would see it early in the morning and it was like I just need to remind myself. And sharing that list, I've always been a man of my word, and I never broke it. And so sharing it with the judge and with my grandmother and telling them, and I was 19 at the point where I wrote this master plan up, and I said, "This is what I'm gonna do," and like I'm a man of my word, and like this is what it is. And so it was pressure to deliver. And it was a lot of temptations in prison, all kinds of stuff. And I was like, I'm going home, and the prison officials, my friends, would be like, "No, you're not. Here, drink this alcohol, like here, smoke this weed." And I was like, "No, I'm getting out." And most folks didn't believe me, but there were a handful of people, like my friend Steven, who mentored me, who kept me on track.
What I thought was interesting about that list is these weren't all like big, audacious goals.
Right, right,
But I mean that in a really complimentary sense that you gave yourself, and I don't know if this is your intent, but there were some that were much more, bite-sized goals that you knew in a finite amount of time you could accomplish. And some of them were bigger ones, taking more years and more time. Was that by design that you wanted to give yourself momentum and, breed confidence and that sort of thing?
right. So that was very important. I'm actually a little surprised that I knew the importance of that back then. It's kind of like now as an entrepreneur or an employer, and you hire someone, you want to give them like some short-term successes that they can achieve to build up the confidence. And so when I wrote the list, it was like, let me see what some things that I could achieve now, and so I could gradually understand and feel what success feels like. And so some of the things, I mean, when I was writing the book, I wanted to take some stuff out because I was a little embarrassed, but I was like, this is the real list, and it evolved over time. And, I think on that on one list was like, I wanted a pair of particular gloves or something like that. Once I got like my car, and it's like, I don't know what I was thinking about, but goals are goals.
So I want to talk about another aspect of how you turned yourself around. And this was, I imagine, a pretty tough thing to do. And maybe this was through therapy you had, but you came to eventually realize that while, yes, you were abused, you were neglected, you were surrounded by crime, surrounded by violence, that you couldn't use that reality as an excuse any longer. You had pulled the trigger, you killed the man.
Right.
So can you talk about that process of owning up to your own decisions, of taking responsibility for your own actions?
This was after having a group session over a period of a couple months titled Victims Impact Group. And then it's a group where victims from the outside come in and you sit down and you have a group with them, and they explain to you like what it feels like to be a victim and like the experiences that they go through. And I remember meeting this older woman who was a victim. And she started out by saying, her car was stolen. And I was like, well, you had insurance, get a new car. She was like, I didn't have money for like to pay the deductible and all that. And it was just a mess. And I didn't even understand that part of like being victimized, but that wasn't why she was really there. And she showed me a picture of her daughter. And she said, what do you think about her, Chris? And I was like, she's cute. Who is that? Like, she was like, this is my daughter. And she passed it around. Everybody like, she's cute. And she says, two men thought she was cute too. And then they grabbed her one day coming home from school, and they raped her and they stabbed her and they chopped her body up and set her on fire. And I remember how I felt with her telling me this. And she says, these guys were monsters like you guys. And then I was thinking, I was like, I could never do that to someone. Like, I'm not a monster. But then I thought about it. Like, on paper, I took a person's life. And society's going to look at me like, it don't matter like what happened. I see you a murderer. You took someone's life. What I thought about was like, there are some monsters in here, but I'm not like that. And so that was the point when I was like, I really got to like prove to myself and everyone else like that my life was redeemable, that I'm not a monster. And it just changed me. And it was like at that moment, I just started like doing things differently. I started opening up in therapy. I started accepting responsibility, which is the most important thing. Like, yes, I'm Black. The deck is stacked against me in America and all that stuff. that being said, I still pulled the trigger. And so I had to set responsibility, and that's when it happened. And I just started talking about it, and it allowed me to move forward.
So after serving time for 16 years, your dream came true. You had finally gotten your life back. May 11th, 2012 was the day you were finally a free man again. Do you recall the feeling? I mean, was it pure elation, or were you already getting anxious about getting back out there and getting integrated back into society? It had been a long time.
I mean, honestly, I was scared. I was scared because, I had worked really hard behind the fence on bettering myself, and I had mentored like hundreds of people and helped all these folks. And there were like some prison officials was like, "We see you when you come back," right? And now I'm out in the real world where it's like, so different and everything's moving so fast paced. I was terrified of failing and not being able to succeed. Like, it's one thing to work on your master plan and talk about stuff in theory, but now I'm out here with just $50 in my pocket, and I got these ideas and these plans, but like, this is the real world where I know because of my criminal background that it'll be hard to get a job. I know that I'm 32 years old, don't have a car, don't have a job. It'll be difficult for any woman to find an interest in me. And so all these things, I was just like a little jittery.
Well, I want to underscore some of this because moving aside from your personal story, just looking more broadly at our system, we create so many obstacles for prisoners who are eventually free to actually make it on the outside. I mean, it's no wonder recidivism rates are so high. So you mentioned $50. That's all you're given, $50. There's no job. There's no shelter for you. Like, there are no prospects. Landlords don't want to rent to ex-prisoners. Business owners don't want to trust them with real jobs of any kind. So the odds are so dramatically stacked against you. How are you able to find your way? Because it seems like almost a Hail Mary pass in some way.
Right. So I knew a few years before my release, I started a career center. What I discovered, and I believe this is still true, the number one way how a person obtains a job is through relationships. So you could write a resume to maybe get an interview, but you'll have to be able to sell yourself, or those letters of references will most likely help you get a job. And so I knew that. And then I knew that if I surrounded myself with positive people, and I had like a few, like my friend Eric, who would come visit me, and my mentor Steve and his family. So I had positive people to give me like moral support, which is very important, and to encourage me, because like I'm from DC. When I got out, I tried to like go out in DC, and like people were just like, "What do you do? Like, where you work at? What kind of car you drive? Why should I be talking to you?" And it was so overwhelming and humiliating. Like, I had a cheap phone from Radio Shack that I probably spent $15 on, and people were laughing at me. I didn't have clothes, and my support system, like my cousin and like my godbrother's parents, like they would just tell me, "Don't worry about them. Be patient. You made it out. You're going to be successful," and that's what helped me make it through. And so I moved to Baltimore, and I said I want to go back to school, and I got this plan, and I have an idea how I can make this happen, which I did through my university.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I mean, almost one of the very first things you did was go and enroll in this college.
Yeah.
So did you feel like education was required for future success, or did you just have such a thirst for knowledge that you said, you know what, I want to do this because I can? Or was it a
Oh,
combination?
it is both. Yeah, it's a combination. So I still feel like that. I'll probably be in school for the rest of my life. But yeah, so I knew that universities are like the nexus of like information and knowledge, and employers would, I assume, would hire from universities. And I knew that I was intelligent. And so I figured if I could go into the school, establish good relationships with my professors, do all the work, and then some outside, or read whatever they need me to read, and form these relationships, that I could probably get a letter of reference from one of these professors to get a job. And I was willing to do anything, but I wanted to work in the community and like work in tough neighborhoods, because that's kind of the environment that I grew up in prison. And so that's exactly what happened. And it took me 51 days.
One of my favorite parts of the book was, you absolutely were determined to get that education, but it really was above your means. And you went and somehow convinced the dean of the business school to sort of, waive, I think at first it was maybe, one semester, and then all of a sudden the rest of your education was free. Retell that story. I love how you did this.
So it started when it was a guy at school who I was friends with, and he had like a cool car, and he was a nice guy. Didn't really take school serious, but he was on a full ride. And I was like, what's the full ride? And it's like, I don't pay for it. And he had money left over, and he would take the money left over and put like some rims on his car. And I was like, why don't I have a full ride? And I asked him too. I said, so what are you doing when you graduate? He's like, I don't even know. I'm just, whatever. I'm just drifting through life. And I was like, this is crazy. And I'm, at this point, like I had a job, I'm working, and still like trying to figure out when I'm getting scholarships and all kinds of stuff to pay for this education. But I knew what I wanted to do. And I knew that I wanted to start a company that helped people. I had all this, I had the plan. So I said, if anybody should have a full ride, it should be me. And I was taught that closed mouths don't get fed. And so I knew that the dean of the business school was a cyclist, and I cycled. And so I just allowed myself to be discovered by the dean at a certain point where I knew she was going to be. I had just won a business pitch competition at the business school. I knew that the dean signed the check, so I thanked her for that. And then I just like asked her, I said, I feel like investing in me and the work that I'm doing is investing in the community. And she was like, what do you mean by that? And I says, well, I'm a social entrepreneur, and I want to start a company to do this and do that. And I feel like you guys should invest in me and cover my education. And she tried to just say, we'll cover your books. Well, I was like, I shouldn't pay for my education ever. And she just looked at me and was like, what is your name? and I told her, I was like, Chris Wilson. And like the next day she sent an email out, and that was it. And we laugh about it now, but I just asked for it. And I've heard stories of people like asking for it. And, I'm like that in business now. Like you ask for stuff, like, can I see a manager? What other options are available for us? And you just ask for it.
Wow. I love it. So let's talk about the social entrepreneurship. You had started some kind of contracting business and employing out of work people. I think even some of these out of work people have been recently released prisoners like you had been.
Right. Yes.
So talk about the germination of that idea and, some of the challenges once you got it going.
So my first job was doing community organizing and workforce development. And I would work with hundreds of people in the toughest neighborhoods in Baltimore City and try to get them jobs. And employers would just turn them down because of like, they got a criminal conviction. I was like, but it was 20 years ago. They show up every day to dress appropriately, like looking for work. Why not give them a shot? And they'd be like, nope, I like you, Chris, but like, I'm not dealing with them. And here I am in business school. And out of frustration, I said, well, what if I started my own company and I was able to vouch and train like these people? And then we could do work on these construction sites with these developers, or do cleaning and moving and hauling. If I had these relationships with these owners of these other businesses and they trusted me, then maybe they would trust me like to do like this work. And so that was kind of like the genesis of like starting the company. And then we grew really fast, and like we just kept going for like years. And it was hard work, but I learned a lot. I learned that like Murphy's Law is pretty accurate. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. But I learned how to pivot and innovate in times like that. So I'm glad I did it.
So Chris, after being locked up for a decade and a half, certainly no one would have, in any way faulted you for focusing on yourself, just trying to make as much money as possible. But you seem really determined to give back and to lift up others around you. So I'm so curious, like, why did you choose that path? Like, why was it so important to you to get into the social entrepreneurship?
So when I was growing up, I was confused when I would be in class or in church or at home, and my grandmother and mom would talk about, you could be successful and look at this person, or look at this who became this. And what confused me was like, why don't they ever come back into the neighborhood? Why don't they ever, like, even my uncle would say, you need to start your own business, or you need to get a job. And it's like, I don't know how to write a resume. I don't know how to start a business. But no one sat down with me and told me how to do it, especially no one who looked like I looked and came from where I come from. And so what I wanted to do was become that person who, I've been to prison. I grew up in a tough neighborhood. I've become successful. but I'm not too good to like sit down with you and show you how to start your company or hire you or judge you because of a decision you made in the past. And I wanted to lead by example. And so that was something that was and still is very important to me.
It feels like you're really the exception to the norm in terms of walking away from your past and becoming this really productive member of society. So take your son, for example, because there's that story too. He had also gotten into trouble with the law, served time in prison. And when he was released, there you were, open arms, ready to accept him. And Chris, you were so generous. You gave him a place to live. You gave him a great job. I mean, a managerial job in your company.
Yeah.
You were there to mentor him, to support him financially, emotionally, everything. And yet, he still managed to slip up and end up back in prison. It's not a reflection, on your son. It's almost like that really seems to be more of the norm, but not you.
Well, I think about this often. One of the things that is very important to me of me staying like focused is I just surround myself with that support system. Now, I was in his life as much as possible, but even when he got off work, he would go across town with his friends and like the projects and the tough neighborhoods. And I would say like, why are you over there? Like you need to like remove yourself from that environment. And he couldn't do it. But I will say that I don't believe I'm the exception to the rule. Like I've made it this far because of people that I surrounded myself with. And to this day, I got people that push me to be the best version of myself. And that's something that I want everyone else to consider. It's like you got to have people around you because like we're not perfect. People are going to like have moments of like, vulnerability or whatever. And, I go to therapy once a week. If something's like off, I got people I can call. And I want us all like to have a system in place like that. Because like a lot of people don't feel like they have anyone to call and they make stupid decisions on their own and they end up back in prison like he did. He should have called me.
Well, this community work you were doing got recognized, and you ended up being invited to the White House with just a handful of others to meet President Obama. I mean, Chris, from prison to the White House in just a few short years, it's crazy. So, first of all, was meeting the President of the United States on that master plan of yours? That's the first question. And
No, it wasn't.
And when you were there, was it just like a surreal moment for you? Like describe that.
So when I won the award, Secret Service wouldn't allow me to enter the White House because I didn't pass security clearance. And I remember saying, like, I'm getting an award from the president. I'm invited. Why can't I get in? And I had to use some influence and threaten to run a story through CNN. And my friends did. And I eventually like passed security clearance. But then that same day, the moment when I'm walking into the White House, some white guy walks up and pulls out a gun on the Secret Service and they shot him. And so I didn't get into the White House that first time.
Oh my God. Wow.
So, so the White House staff eventually felt bad about me not getting in. So they eventually like invited me back, but I didn't unfortunately get a chance to meet the president on the second time. And I went back like a third time, a fourth time, but it was just to speak and stuff. So I didn't get a chance to meet him. I was supposed to. It was terrible.
Well, we got to make this happen now. Chris, maybe had it been on your master plan.
I know.
So, Chris, I know you're a big advocate for reduced sentencing. The prison should be about rehabilitation and, of course, integrating prisoners back into society, just as you have done. So is that sentiment meant just for minors like you had been? Or do you feel anyone locked up for any crime whatsoever should be allowed a second chance?
That's an interesting question. I would say this. I spent half my life in prison. And to be honest with you, there's a small percentage of people in there who are monsters. And what I mean by that, when I've spoken to these people, I've lived around them, like people who maybe it's a mental illness or something. You let them out their cell, they kill anything around them. I've seen it happen. So people that are that dangerous, they belong in prison. The vast majority of people in prison should have a second chance. But when people go to prison, maybe they committed a crime, maybe there's some type of deficiency, maybe there's some barriers. I'm a big believer in therapy and education. If you do what you have to do and you demonstrate like rehabilitate that you've been rehabilitated, I feel like at that point, whatever point that is in your sentence, you deserve a chance to be considered for a second chance. And that's my philosophy.
I mean, again, you're clearly this model example of what rehabilitation, is meant to do. And just so you know, personally, I think you deserve it 100%. And I think what you've done since you've been out is more impressive than what most people do in their entire lifetimes. So my hat's off to you. But just to play devil's advocate for a moment, what do you say to people who are listening who would say, well, I mean, a life sentence should mean life. You took someone else's life away, and, therefore you shouldn't have one of your own. Like you lost that right once you pulled that trigger.
Right. I mean, I would say to them, I made this decision as a child, right? And if you think about like children whose brains aren't developed, and you think about, if you factor in all the stuff that I've been through, I shouldn't have had my life thrown away forever, right? And so I feel like I've demonstrated that I've been rehabilitated. I've helped 275 people in Baltimore City get jobs. Less than 10 of those jobs was minimum wage. I won every award in the state of Maryland. I've helped people start companies. I've advocated on Capitol Hill. I've negotiated ceasefires between gangs, all kinds of stuff, right? And yeah, maybe some people feel like I should be locked away for life, but like I committed my crime as a child. I'm a good person, and I deserve a second chance. And so, but people can feel how they want to feel, but like I'm doing a good. And not only that, like I'm successful now. I've started a foundation. I fund programs, art programs. I mentor children. I'm doing everything I can do to attempt to make up for like the wrong I've done. But I know I can't do that. But like I'm gonna live the rest of my life doing this. And so I feel like I've earned a place in society.
What is left on the master plan that you have yet to check off? Give me a couple of the big ones.
So I didn't go skydiving yet because I was going to do it before I went on tour. But like my publisher was like, how about you risk your life after the book tour?
Yeah, it'd be hard to do interviews if the parachute didn't open, that's for sure.
Right. So I didn't do that. I think the last thing on my list was I wanted to settle down and meet a smart, beautiful woman that's like business savvy I can talk shop with. So that hasn't happened yet. I'm optimistic. So that hasn't happened. I'm honestly thinking about adding some other like goals to the master plan, revising it because it's about 90% done. I just bought a new home 2 weeks ago in a beautiful neighborhood, which was on the master plan. So I was very happy about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you. The past 2.5 years, I started making art, painting and doing shows. And I've been using my art money. I started a foundation. And what I want to add to my list is I want to be a successful, I consider myself a successful artist already. I bought the house and I paid off all my cars and all my debt, but I want to be a successful artist and I want to tell people stories through my art. So that's why I'm here in Paris now.
The name of this podcast is The Art of Excellence, speaking of art. So I don't define excellence because I like my guests to define it for themselves. How do you define it?
I will define excellence as pushing yourself or achieving high standards and just being like the best version of yourself and doing it in a way that's humble and considerate. I like to achieve my goals in a way where I lift other people up around me and mentor and pass the torch to the next people coming up and being humble with my success. That's how I would define it.
Well, the book just about brought me to tears multiple times. A range of emotions. I upset. I was angry. I don't know that I ever got angry at you. It was more angry at all the circumstances to lead that, to what you did. If you have an option off the movie rights, may I make the first offer because
we're working on it.
It's such a wonderful story. Chris, I can't thank you enough for sharing the story with me and my listeners. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.